These images from Budapest mark the moment Vladimir Putin's European strategy collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of angry Hungarian citizens filled the streets with a cry echoing from the dark days of 69 years ago. Russians, go home! Viktor Orbán, Vladimir Putin's most trusted ally, attempted to organize a peace rally on October 23, 2025, with the support of Russian media outlets. However, the Hungarian people have known since 1956 that Putin's word peace means invasion. But the nightmare Putin faces is not limited to the anger of the Hungarian people. As the streets of Budapest echoed with these angry slogans, it was both an economic and geostrategic nightmare for Putin. On one side, there was his ally Orban rushing to Washington. On the other, a legal bomb emerging from Poland that could turn the Druzhba oil pipeline, the lifeblood of Putin's coffers, into a legitimate military target. Now, Putin's last stronghold in Europe is on the verge of being paralyzed in this triple squeeze. To understand why the chaos Putin is experiencing is so deep and dangerous, one must look at the significance of October 23rd in the Hungarian national consciousness, at that deep collective trauma. This is not just an ordinary day on the calendar. It is a symbol of a national wound, of heroism, and most importantly, of betrayal by Moscow. The 1956 Hungarian uprising began on that very day, with a cry for freedom against years of brutal Soviet oppression, communist one-party dictatorship, and Moscow-appointed puppet rulers. That year, peaceful demonstrations initiated by university students quickly turned into a nationwide revolution. Reformist leader Imre Nagy became prime minister, promised free elections, and took the most daring step by announcing Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact and its intention to become a neutral country. The Kremlin's response to this bold quest for freedom was brutal and disproportionate. On November 4, 1956, more than 200,000 Soviet troops and thousands of tanks moved in to crush Budapest. The leader of the revolution, Imre Nagy, was trapped, tried, and executed. More than 200,000 Hungarians were forced to flee their country to escape Soviet oppression. The year 1956 was indelibly etched into the Hungarian national DNA with the words Moscow, oppression, occupation, and betrayal. Now, in 2025, on the 69th anniversary of this historical trauma, as confirmed by the Knutsford Guardian and other international agencies, hundreds of thousands of Hungarians were shouting the same terrible legacy in Viktor Orbán's face. The spark that ignited this wave of rebellion was Péter Magyar, a charismatic lawyer who emerged from Orbán's own Fidesz party, understood all the dynamics of the system, and became the regime's main rival. Magyar had been exposing the Orbán regime's corruption for months. However, his speech on October 23rd focused directly on Orbán's relationship with Russia. Magyar directly compared Orbán's pro-Russian policies against Ukraine and his constant defense of Moscow's interests against the European Union to the Soviet tyranny of 1956 and the Hungarian collaborators of that era. Péter Magyar's call to be worthy heirs to the heroes of 1956 resonated strongly with the crowd. The chanting of "Russians go home" by hundreds of thousands of people was not only a reaction to the war in Ukraine, but also a declaration of the perception that Orbán is betraying his own people's history and the legacy of those lost in 1956. Polls show that Magyar's rise has left Orbán facing the most serious threat to his 15 years in power. The peace march Orbán attempted to organize that same day, which was also covered by TASS, seemed weak and meaningless in the face of this revolutionary anger and historical reckoning. Orbán was facing the ghosts of 1956, and this time the enemy was not only the crowds in the streets, but Hungarian history itself. As the streets of Budapest echoed with the ghosts of 1956, Viktor Orbán's nightmare was not limited to the home front. Outside, especially on the other side of the Atlantic, he was facing the strategic impasse he had created. The paradox was this: Orbán had been trying for months to market Donald Trump, whom he saw as his ideological ally and friend, as the only leader who understood Putin and could bring peace to Ukraine. According to information reported by Reuters, there were even plans for an ambitious Budapest peace summit that would bring Trump, Putin, and Zelensky together. Orbán hoped to see Trump's victory as a personal triumph in his battle against Brussels. However, This image of ideological friendship clashed with harsh economic realities, and most importantly, with the friction created by Orban's own strategies with Putin. In the US, the America First approach, regardless of who is in power, puts Washington's own security and economic priorities at the center. Secondary sanctions in energy and financial channels are well-known tools of this set of priorities. The problem was not Trump's personal animosity toward Orban. The problem was that Orban's high dependence on Russian energy flows created serious friction with the EU and NATO over the Ukraine issue. As Politico Pro also analyzed, when the Trump administration increased economic pressure on Russia, the target of these sanctions inevitably included the Hungarian economy, which continued to do business with these companies. This situation triggered Orban's panic. According to leaked analyses and behind-the-scenes comments, Orban was forced to rush to Washington and personally ask Trump for an exemption from these sanctions due to their potential to devastate the Hungarian economy. This showed how the rhetoric of ideological friendship evaporated in the face of the economic impasse created by Putin. Washington's position was complex. The US administration was signaling that it could show flexibility in areas such as energy sanctions if Orban's government moved toward more visible coordination with EU and NATO policies. In short, the trigger for the tension was not Trump's desire for punishment, but the strategic friction created by the policies pursued by Orban and Putin themselves. For Putin, this was one of the worst-case scenarios. His only ally in the EU, Orban, now needed the approval of the US president to survive economically, precisely because of Putin's policies. Washington could demand that Hungary lift its veto on EU aid to Ukraine as the price of an exception. Putin's Trojan Horse had fallen into a trap of its own making. At the heart of Viktor Orbán's years of pro-Russian policies, and especially his dependence on the Druzhba pipeline that tied Hungary to Russian oil, there was always a simple but effective argument: I cannot change geography. Orban claimed that Hungary was a landlocked country with no access to the sea and therefore had no alternative to cheap Russian oil, arguing that this was not an ideological choice but an economic necessity. He used this argument as a shield both to silence domestic opposition and to resist sanctions pressure from Brussels. However, as of October 2025, this geography is destiny propaganda is crumbling under the weight of diplomatic and economic realities. At the heart of Orban's predicament, both domestically and internationally, lies the exposure of this lie. The clearest and most devastating response to Orban's no alternative claim came from the European Commission. Brussels offered a concrete, feasible, and cost-effective alternative to end Hungary's dependence on Russian oil. The EU Commission guaranteed that the oil Hungary needs could be transported via the Adriatic pipeline through Croatia, and that it could cost almost the same as Russian oil, or potentially even less. Moreover, this route was much shorter and much safer than the Druzhba pipeline, which comes from Russia and passes through Ukrainian territory, putting it at risk at any moment. This statement undermined Orban's excuse of economic necessity. According to an analysis published on Medium, Hungary's dependence on Russian oil has risen from about 61% before the war to nearly 86% today. This was not a necessity, but a deliberate ideological choice. Another blow to Orban's excuses came from Washington. The US ambassador to NATO stated in a statement that Hungary had never presented a serious plan or request regarding this alternative, but had instead tried to block this solution. The ambassador emphasized that the US strongly supports the Croatian option. These two statements demolished Orban's entire defense strategy. It has now been revealed that his pro-Russian stance is not a geographical or economic necessity, but entirely an ideological and political choice, a deliberate decision to support the Putin regime. These lies and the economic stagnation and inflation they caused are also at the root of the internal uprising. The people are beginning to understand that dependence on Russia is not a necessity, but a betrayal. While Viktor Orbán was grappling with the uprising in the streets of Budapest and diplomatic pressure from Washington, on October 26th, the third and perhaps most deadly blow came from a courtroom in Poland. It was a legal bomb that directly targeted Hungary's economic lifeline and Putin's last oil artery flowing into Europe. The blow came via a German extradition request case related to the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. While refusing to extradite a Ukrainian suspect, the Polish court delivered a ruling in its reasoned decision that could affect the fate of all of Europe, and Hungary in particular. The Polish judge, defining Russia as an aggressor, stated, If Ukraine organized an armed mission to destroy the enemy's pipelines, these actions were not illegal, but rather justified, rational and fair. This ruling set a critical precedent, showing that the judiciary of an EU and NATO member country viewed Russian energy infrastructure as to finance the war, and recognized attacks on this infrastructure as legitimate defense. Hungarian Foreign Minister Péter Magyar's reaction was panicked. Scandal. Poland is celebrating terrorists. Why the panic? Because this ruling sealed the fate of the Druzhba pipeline, the oil artery that runs from Russia through Ukraine to Hungary and keeps the Orban regime afloat. The Polish court's decision provided Ukraine with the legal and diplomatic shield it needed to strike at the Druzhba pipeline as retaliation for Hungary's vetoes within the EU or its pro-Russian policies. Now, if Ukraine cut off Putin's last lifeline in Europe, it could be defended as legitimate self-defense, not a terrorist act. The plug of Orban's economic life support unit was now in Kiev's hands. This logistical threat brought Orban's already shaky power to the brink of collapse. As of the end of October 2025, Viktor Orbán is trapped in a strategic trap. The double game he has been playing for years has now reached an unsustainable point. Orbán is now caught between three fires, feeding off each other, both from within and without. This is a diplomatic chess move that paralyzes Putin's most important stronghold within the European Union, the Trojan Horse that locks down the EU's aid to Ukraine with the threat of veto in every critical vote. Orban now has no good options left. The dilemma is this: if Orban insists on continuing his current pro-Russia policies, he will face disaster. Tough secondary sanctions by the US, targeting Hungarian companies that continue to process Russian oil, could collapse the country's financial system. Ukraine, relying on the legitimate target decision of the Polish court, could strike the Druzhba pipeline in retaliation for Hungary's veto. This would mean an immediate halt to the Hungarian economy. Most importantly, hundreds of thousands of Hungarians shouting "Russians go home" in the streets of Budapest, remembering the legacy of 1956, will no longer accept Orban's blatant collaboration with Russia. The popular movement led by Péter Magyar could oust Orban from power. If Orban bows to this pressure, shifts course toward the West, abandons Russian oil, and fully supports the EU's Ukraine policies, this could also spell political suicide for him. Orban has built his entire political career on the image of a leader fighting against Brussels bureaucrats and the liberal West. Now, yielding to the demands of Brussels and Washington would mean humiliation and ideological bankruptcy in front of his own voter base. Russia could cut off the last remaining energy flows to Hungary, launch cyber attacks, or incite far-right groups within the country to destabilize the Orban regime. In either scenario, Orban loses. There is no playing field left. He has fallen into a trap. And when Orban falls into the trap, Putin also loses his most important weapon within the European Union, his veto power and his ability to divide the EU from within. This crisis in Budapest is, in fact, a direct strategic defeat for Moscow. What is happening in Budapest is not just about Hungary's internal politics or the dynamics of the European Union. These events are directly linked to Vladimir Putin's own fate and the survival of his regime. Orban's potential downfall is a geopolitical earthquake that brings Moscow one step closer to the scenario of regime change, Putin's greatest fear. Polish Deputy Prime Minister Radosław Sikorski recently laid out this bigger picture clearly in a strategic analysis. Sikorski compared Putin's war in Ukraine to Russia's colonial wars of the past. He noted that such wars are usually protracted and end in military defeat. However, the most striking point in Sikorski's analysis was this: colonial wars that end in such disaster are usually ended not by the team that started the war, but by a different team that comes to power after them, i.e., with a change of regime. Orban's potential fall from power in Hungary is a development that accelerates Putin's nightmare. Orban's fall would mean Putin losing his last and most vocal diplomatic support in Europe. No one within the EU would remain to veto aid to Ukraine or water down sanctions against Russia. This situation would increase Western support for Ukraine and push Russia's economic and military pressure to its highest level. This could accelerate Russia's military defeat on the ground. As military defeat accelerates, the regime change dynamic Sikorski mentioned also gains strength in Moscow. Failures on the front lines, economic collapse, and diplomatic isolation will cause the Kremlin elite to question their loyalty to Putin. Orban's downfall in Budapest could mean not only the loss of an ally, but also the toppling of a domino that signals the beginning of the end in Moscow. As we approach the end of our video, let's slowly wrap things up. By the end of October 2025, Putin's stronghold in Europe is under simultaneous siege from within and without. In the streets of Budapest, the grandchildren of 1956 ignite the flames of a democratic uprising, while a court ruling in Poland puts Hungary's lifeline within range of a military target. Putin's veto power, which he used to paralyze Europe, has been rendered effectively useless in the face of this legal bomb, the threat of US sanctions, and internal chaos. The stronghold has fallen. Thank you for choosing us.